I'm building a 12-foot Glen-L Squirt runabout. It's modeled after the mahogany boats of the 1950s, and this is only an 11-foot long model. I'm building a Johnson, a 1958 Johnson, 18 horsepower motor. It's a two-cylinder, two-stroke motor, vintage. It's got the cool factor out the wazoo. It's an awesome little motor. They made it the same motor from 1956 or so, all the way to maybe 1971 or 72. It's basically the same Powerhead. So what I want to do with this video is show you a disassembled 18 horsepower, so you can kind of get an idea of how the thing comes together, how it comes apart, the various pieces, parts in it. If you're rebuilding one of these, this hopefully will help you. It's not intended to present how to rebuild the motor, but I'm going to be dealing with scored cylinders or scored pistons, a busted lower unit, a broken skeg, different things like that, and then hopefully at the end of this you'll see how the whole thing comes together, comes apart. So let's take a look. So on my bench I have two motors disassembled. I've got all of one and a few critical components of the other. So I want to show you a few different things about all of this. And the first thing is I'm starting with a 1958, which is an FD12, and I also have an FD15, which is a 1961. So the 1961 cover looks like this, and the 1958 cover looks like this. And it didn't look like that when I started with it. It looked very, very rough. In fact, it looked pretty similar to that, but I've already finished it and painted it, and I'm ready for decals, but that's a different story. So this is the 1961 Powerhead, and the 1961 Powerhead, you can see from the intake side to the cylinder head side, crank in the center. So this motor is still mostly assembled. What's disassembled is from the front on the intake side. On the intake side is the reed plate. This is the intake. So this mounts here, and there's the intake cover, the cam follower for the ignition advance, small little intake port here where the carburetor mounts, and that's all there really is to the front end. The top end of this motor is you have the carburetor, then the carburetor's mounting intake plate, the reed plate, which goes in this direction. Actually, I think I held it up backwards maybe, but the reeds are, that's the only moving part in the whole intake system, other than the rotating, the reciprocating assembly, the pistons and the connecting rods and the crank. These are little reed plates that act as little valves, and they flap in and out, in and out, in and out as the motor goes through its various strokes. So this assembled motor, this 1961, has on it, has this exhaust inspection port, and you can see on this side, this is the exhaust side of the motor. On the other side is the intake side of the motor. This is the intake. So this is actually pulling from the crankcase, and it pulls in through little holes back here, and then it goes into the cylinder right here. You can see the pistons that are going by there. That piston is at a point where the rings are past the intake ports, and here this piston is actually in a position where the rings, you can see the rings through there, where the rings are at the intake port. This head happens to be stuck. I haven't been able to get it off, but I don't need to. I was taking two of them apart to see which ones were the best parts to put from the two motors. So this 1961 has a thermostat housing on the head. And then you'll notice that the 61 model has the water jacket. The water jacket actually comes all the way forward, just to the bottom of the head. There's the inspection cover. So this cover comes off. You can see where the water jacket is all here. I have also a 1958 block. This is the one I'm building, and this one is a little bit different. It's not drastically different, but it's different enough. So let's see if I can get this oriented similarly. Okay, so again, here's the intake ports. Here's the crankcase, or the bottom where the the top part of where the crank mounts. You see the bottom of the cylinders, top of the cylinders. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 bolts that hold the head on, and the head is nothing more than a cover plate. Nothing to it. The head on the 1958 has those 10 bolts. Combustion chamber on the inside, which has already been cleaned of carbon. You'll notice that this head has the water jacket, comes around for cooling of the top of the cylinder head, but it is a little bit different than the 1961. On the 1961, if you remember right where the head mounts, there was a water jacket that came here. This. So the blocks are not exactly identical. Not every part is interchangeable, but the reciprocating assembly is interchangeable. A lot of different, the reed plates are interchangeable, the intake's interchangeable, but there's a number of other things that are not. So let's see, this motor has on it, this is the block itself. So what I want to cover is the pistons that came out of here. The pistons that came out of this motor scared me. They look very similar to these. I thought these were going to be better. When I looked at the exhaust side of the piston, you'll notice that piston's shiny right here, shiny right there, and then black as night right there, and also scuffed and scored. I don't know if it's going to ever focus on that. But that piston looks very similar to this piston. You see the rings are some carbon steel as opposed to the piston, which is aluminum. So now you'll notice that the piston is really thin. Compare the thickness of this piston to the thickness of the block. So even though this looks like it was starved of oil, or it had too lean of an oil fuel mixture, because this motor gets all of its lubrication from the oil that you put in with the gasoline. So this piston, and both of them were scored, but one of them was worse than the other one. It didn't leave any significant, no appreciable, it's not showing up, I can see it without having a light. There's nothing to catch your fingernail on in any one of these cylinders. So these cylinders are actually, they have no ridge, there's no ridge on them. I have put a piston ring inside of both, and I've slid them all the way down to the bottom, and when I've done that, it maintains the same amount of cylindrical shape or circular shape. You don't detect light past the ring, so I can see that the rings are going to seat. What else in the power head? So let's look at the crank. Actually, let's go to this. Here's a replacement piston. And what's interesting about these motors is that the replacement piston, I don't think they make these new anymore. I'm pretty sure this is a new old stock. I got this from, I believe, marineengines.com. It's about $60 for the piston. I got two of them. If I was going to replace one, I said, well, let's replace both of them. So one of the things that you'll notice about the piston is that it's very shiny. And that sounds like kind of childish until you think about, well, no, what I mean by that is it's very smooth. If you've ever rebuilt a four-stroke motor, these are two strokes. So the two-stroke, the intake valve or the intake operation, exhaust operation, this skirt of the piston, the wall of the piston, needs to seal off those ports. So these ports, when it goes by these ports, it needs to seal that off, as opposed to a four-stroke motor, and happens to be a mid-1990s Chevrolet. The sides of the pistons are actually knurled. There's a shape, a texture to them that pulls the oil and keeps the cylinder wall lubricated. Well, it's not the case here. These things need to seal off the intake and the exhaust. And so, if you're looking at this piston, there's no way I was going to expect this to do this. In fact, I thought this was going to result in a scored cylinder bore, but it didn't. So the new piston will certainly do a lot better with new rings. I think I may have been able to salvage these rings, but I didn't want to take a chance, so I ordered new rings, and these were $60 a piece. I say a piece, $60 for a set of three. There's three on the piston. The $60 is a reasonable price. If you notice, this is an old package, so again, this is probably new old stock. And what's different about these rings from a ring in say a four-stroke V8, you'll notice there's a little indentation on both sides. So when this ring comes together, it's got spring tension, but when this ring comes together, it closes like that. And when it closes like that, it is looking for an index pin that is right there. And that's unlike a piston like you might have in a motor like that. Those rings, when you put the rings in, you index them 180 degrees apart, or you phase them so that you at least get it started initially, so that you don't have these gaps all aligned. But the thing is those rings are free to rotate 360 degrees. They can spin around as the motor's running. That's not the case with this. It's a light little connecting rod. Here's one. The other piston, I actually just mocked it up and put it back on the crank. But here's the crank. On the crank, there's a bearing. It's a roller bearing. It's got little needle bearings on the inside. Hopefully you can see that. Needle bearings on the inside. It's also got a seal, an oil seal on the outside. We can get it. I don't know if the light is going to cooperate, but there's an oil seal on the outside of that. And then on the other side, there's also oil seals. There's an O-ring. There's an oil seal here. And then when you put these together, there's needle bearings. There's a top cap and a lower cap, and then there's I forget. There's 14 bearings maybe in here. Might be 16 bearings, but there's enough. I think there's 14 or 15. I don't remember how many, but they go all the way around. It's in two halves. You have to use grease in order to keep them from falling out when you're putting them together. The piston floats on the wrist pin. You can see here, slides this way. Wrist pin is held in with a little C-clip. There's a C-clip inside of there, and you'll see the other side of this piston is scored to a point where it's goobered up the access to the wrist pin. So one of the things I also want to mention, this video is already getting to a longer length than what I wanted to do, but hopefully this is going to help somebody. The inside of the lower unit, at the top of the lower unit, is the water pump impeller, and you'll notice this. See how this is cracked? This other one is cracked too. One of these is from the 1961, and the other one's from the 1958. And when these are new, they look straight. They're perfectly straight, and then you bend them. They end up taking this set over time. But the guy that I bought the motors from said, "Oh yeah, they run." And I ran into him a couple months later, and he says, "Oh man, did you start them up? Did you start them up? Oh man, they sound so great when they're running." And I was like, "No, I'm going to wait until I take it apart." And it's a good thing that I did, because there were so many things that were wrong with this. In both motors, the water pump impellers were failing. So I'm sure a couple of spins in the motor, a couple of rotations, the next thing you know, you're not flowing water. And if you're not flowing water, then you're going to overheat it. And if you overheat it, guess what? Scored piston. So I wasn't going to do that. Another thing was in the lower unit. The 1958 lower unit has gears like this, and the 1961 has a more modern cog sort of setup. It's got the clutch, what they call a clutch dog, so the dog goes back and forth and engages the forward drive or the rear drive, so that the crankshaft is turning the same way all the time, front to back. Engages forward or reverse. This assembly came out of the 1961. It's got the same shaft from the 1958, but the gears, if you look at the gears are different. This is more of a worm drive looking sort of a setup, and this is perpendicular. So these have a bit of an angle to them, and these are straight up and down and square. I noticed that this lower unit on the 58 must have been locked up. I don't know if you can tell, but there's an indexing pin that goes in here that holds the prop from rotating, and it is warped. I would not doubt if this entire prop shaft is bent. So I went with the 1961. I'm going to go with it. I say went. I haven't put it together yet. And this is the intake plate from the 1958. That's the inlet side. That's the side on the back side that faces towards the pistons, or towards the crankcase. Carburetors on these two motors. This is the carburetor in the 1958. It's almost exactly the same as the one in the 1961. The 1961 is here. If you've ever looked at the front of these, the 1958 has two. It's got the high RPM and then the low RPM. The high and the low RPM richness adjustments. Well, the 1961 carburetor has the same thing, except they've got a little linkage mechanism that goes and allows you to turn. There's an inner knob and an outer knob, and you go to one knob to adjust the high and the low. And on the 1958, it's different, but it's only different because of the linkage. So if you have a carburetor that's not from this model, I think the two are basically the same. I noticed the choke mechanism was the same. The choke plate was the same. So to me, they impressed me to be basically the same carburetor. What I did when I took this motor apart was, before I took it apart actually, I went on outboardmotors.com and I looked at all the parts diagrams. And if I went through the Powerhead unit, gear case unit, everything. And if it was a hard part, I didn't order it. If it was a soft part, I ordered it. If they didn't have the soft part available, I jotted down the part number and I looked for an alternate source. A lot of it came out of new old stock, but basically every single gasket, O-ring, seal, anything that's rubber, anything that's paper, anything that's fibrous, getting rid of it. We got brand new plug wires, brand new coils for it. In fact, let's look at the magneto coil setup. So there's the coil setup. I've got one that's assembled and one that's disassembled, and you'll notice, look, there's the coil. To fire up a motor like this that's 60 years old and say, oh yeah, I just ran, it runs, well, you're liable to break it in some form of permanence, something that you can't recover. So right now, this motor is good enough to rebuild. I am going to rebuild it. This weekend I'll be continuing to reassemble it, to continue cleaning it up. See some other differences between the 58 and the 61. Some of the brackets are similar but different, and I think it's mainly to receive the cover. What else can we go over? There's some gaskets you won't be able to find, and you can see it's not available anymore. And like for one example, there's a seal that goes in between the skeg on the lower unit. It's called a spaghetti seal, and it goes right in here. And you'll look and you'll say, part not available. Well, great. Okay, well, no problem. You can, plenty of sources you can go find spaghetti seal. It's basically O-ring material. And this, you just cut this to length. I had to buy 10 feet for $2, pay $10 of shipping, and all I need is just enough to do that. What else can we cover? Here's the other thing. Guy said, start it up. Oh yeah, it runs great, I don't know how long it's been laid up, but there's the thermostat. Let's see if we can get it where we can see it. There we go. The thermostat. That's the thermostat. If you can imagine trying to start that motor and say, oh yeah, the water's flowing, why? It just doesn't make sense. So something else that was in similar condition to this were both floats. The floats in the carburetors, they were cork, they were shriveled, they were dancing around on the needle, the little metal part, the metal tab that moves the needle up and down, in and out of the seat. So, if I've got one of these motors, I'm not firing it up. I don't know that you have to disassemble it as far down as I have. I decided that I just wanted to do this. I did not want to take a chance. So I've taken it apart, and I'm going with this block. I'm happy that I'm doing so. Like I said, I've got brand new pistons. So with the new pistons in the bore, in fact, you can kind of see it's got a nice snug fit. And I know that's not a machinist testing it, but I know that it's good. I don't know, I'm almost 20 minutes into this video, and I'm looking at things, parts all the way around, and I wish I could have more time to go over more things, but I think this gives you the gist of it. Just while it's in front of me, this is the flywheel from the 1961, and the flywheel from the 1961 happened to have the gear ring, the cog for the starter, even though it was not electric start. And this is the flywheel for the 1958. I've looked up the part numbers, and if you can find a flywheel and or the outer gear ring from any one of these models, they just replace the one that doesn't have it. So if you wanted to convert it to electric start, which I think I may one day, I've at least got the gear. The only thing I need is the bracket, and it may actually be one of these brackets. I don't know that I've got it or not, don't have it. So that is pretty much it. I really wish this helps somebody. I don't have time to go over the skeg, but I'll show you. I've got another skeg. I'll do that in another video maybe. But anyway, I hope this helps somebody figure out what you're doing with the 1956 or so through 1972 Johnson 2-cylinder. I think it's basically the same thing for the 9 horsepower maybe, or 10 horsepower all the way through the 20. It may even cover other models other than that, but it's easy. I really think it's easy. I don't think it's a bad deal at all. I think it's very simple. So hope this helps. If you like it, great. If not, oh well. Hopefully you get something out of it. Appreciate you watching. Good luck with your project.